intern at the LGBTQ Plus Center, and I'm also a PhD candidate in sociology. So I wanted to take a moment to officially welcome you all to our event celebrating International Pronouns Day. This event was a collaboration between QGrad, which is our queer graduate student organization, and the LGBTQ Plus Center, with funding provided by the Graduate Student Senate. Thank you so much to them. They were able to make it happen so that we could have Dr. Beemyn with us today. We would also like to give a special thank you to Dr. Beemyn for making time for us today and reorganizing their schedule. Thank you so much. We also wanted to make you all aware that we will be recording this talk today so that anybody who couldn't come will have this information available to them, just so that you know. Just like a short little blurb about what International Pronoun Day is, it seeks to make respecting, sharing, and educating personal pronouns a commonplace thing that we just do in everyday life. Referring to people by pronouns that they determine for themselves is basic human dignity. Being referred to by the wrong pronouns particularly affects transgender and gender nonconforming people, and together we can transform society to celebrate people's multiple and intersecting identities. And with that, Matthew, I will pass it over to you so that you can introduce our speaker.
All right, thank you, Kayla. Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Fowler. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm an intern at the LGBTQ Plus Center and an undergraduate public health student. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending our session today for International Pronouns Day, and I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Genny Beemyn. Genny is the director of the Stonewall Center at University of Massachusetts Amherst, a co-chair for International Pronouns Day, and a coordinator for the Campus Pride Index. They are here today to talk with us about International Pronouns Day and also about their journey to integrating pronouns into the University of Massachusetts. Genny, whenever you're ready.
Sure. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, and happy International Pronouns Day. Pronouns are important because people get misgendered a lot because we make assumptions about people's gender by their presentation and then use gender language to describe them. You know, we make a lot of assumptions about people when we meet them. We make assumptions about age, about race, by how they dress, maybe about class or religion. And we make assumptions about gender, but gender is different in that we sort of put our stupid assumptions out there by gendering people. And that's inappropriate to be doing because it ends up misgendering people and makes people feel uncomfortable, marginalized, and invisible. So we need to be asking what people's pronouns are before we put out there a gender for people, and then respecting how people identify. And it really is a form of harassment to keep misgendering someone, whether it's deliberately or by failing to learn the right pronouns to use for somebody. That's really insulting, and it really is a hate incident and needs to be addressed as such. We began International Pronouns Day 3 years ago. Shige Sakurai and myself. They're the director of the LGBT Equity Center in Maryland, and they started Pronouns Day at their university. And they're a friend of mine, and I called them and said, hey, that's a great idea. You did that. Tell me more about what you did there so I can do it at UMass. And got to talking, and we decided, hey, let's try to make this into a bigger thing and not just our two campuses. Let's see if we could make this a national thing. And then we talked some more and decided, like, why not do international, you know, and try to really make this something. And so it's great to see how it's taken off in the past 3 years. I was co-chair for the first 2 years. It's a lot of work, so I decided to step down for this year. But as was mentioned at the outset, you know, it's an important day to call attention to the need to recognize, ask, and respect pronouns. And it's especially important today because more and more folks are identifying as non-binary, as using they, them pronouns or other pronouns other than he and she. This is findings from one of the largest studies of college students. And you see there just the number of folks who identify as non-binary. It's by far the largest under the transgender umbrella are folks who identify as non-binary. We also see this from surveys that have been done, which indicate that a large number of folks in this generation, Gen Z, report knowing someone who identifies as non-binary, who goes by non-binary pronouns, much more frequent than previous generations of individuals. And we also see just the rise of acceptance of they, them in the singular. It's been amazing in the last 5 years just to see how much this has caught on. I've been going by non-binary pronouns now for 20 years, and it's been a struggle to get people to understand that, remember that, respect that. A lot different today when pretty much every style guide, every dictionary includes they, them in the singular. And it's become so popular that it's being declared words of the year and words of the decade. So really it's becoming something. And then of course you have the rise in the number of places online where you can indicate a range of genders. Again, this is such a sea change from what it was 10, 20 years ago when all you had was M and F to choose from on anything. And so as someone who's non-binary, it was always a pain in the butt, always felt marginalizing to have to choose one or the other if I couldn't avoid the question, which I would do if I could. Now it's great to see so many options that people have on a lot of forums, a lot of things online. Still not a majority, but a good number of places online recognize that there's more than M and F as choices. And the growing number of states who are giving folks the ability to indicate non-binary on driver's licenses and birth certificates. Still not the majority of states by any means, but just in the last couple of years, we were seeing this trend, and I got to believe it's going to continue in the years to come. It was this past year, Massachusetts had non-binary, so I was one of the first people in the state to have an X on my driver's license, which is, I'm not happy about just like an X, because I don't identify as like X, like a secret agent, I'm X. But it's better than nothing. I would love to see the ability to be able to actually specify what your gender is on a license if you need it in the first place, which I would argue you don't even need it in the first place to have it on a license. They removed race on licenses and other documents. Like, why do we have to have gender on that as well? But if you're going to have it, you should have really an inclusive set of opportunities for people. But colleges, surprisingly enough, are behind the curve when it comes to offering non-binary options. We're seeing other places doing it, even states doing it, but colleges don't offer non-binary options. These are the states that, the colleges and universities that I know that give folks the ability to indicate pronouns on course rosters. Not that much. It's shocking that in 2020, we still have so few colleges that offer this opportunity for students to be able to be gendered appropriately, to be able to indicate their pronouns if they want to, so that professors and other staff folks know how they identify themselves. At UMass, we have pronouns on, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but it was a huge struggle to have that happen. As I say there, this took place long after the time that I was able to get a chosen name and gender marker change options for students, which at the time, few schools did those things, and actually still, unfortunately, few schools do those things, but even fewer did so 8 years ago. And so our administration folks never once want to be the trendsetters, as I think is the case with most institutions. We'll come back to that. Well, let's address pronouns at a later date. And of course, time passed, and it was difficult to get folks to want to pick up that conversation again and to have pronouns. I finally hit upon a strategy where I couldn't get folks to come back around a table to talk about pronouns. So I got someone much more higher ranking than myself at the university who had been involved in the whole name change option discussion to convene a meeting to get people back at the table. And people listened to her. And so people were willing to come back and then have that conversation. And once we started having the conversation, it was a no-brainer to actually move forward. It was just started getting the momentum going and picking up the conversation, because it wasn't people opposed to it. It's just the status quo was so easy, right? You know, you don't need to do anything, so let's not do anything. But once people realized that this was something we should do, and got people thinking, and there was no opposition to it once we got people around the table to figure out, okay, let's do this. How do we do it? Here's some figures about some of the schools that offer a pronoun option to give you a sense of the numbers of folks who identify their pronouns and what the percentages are of different pronoun options. University of Iowa, which is actually one of my alma maters, is the only college in the country that asks pronouns on their admission form, which I think is what needs to happen. So, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Because of course you get much larger numbers of folks who will then respond to the question than if you have to go and indicate your pronouns. You see there that she and her majority at pretty much all institutions, they, them is small number of people, but not insignificant number of folks in institutions. The ones that offer Z here, Z, Zir, very few students take those opportunities. At UMass, these are the options that we give to students to be able to self-identify. And unfortunately, folks can only choose one option. I would love to have done more than one option, but apparently I was told that it's not something we can do easily from a software perspective. So had to keep it just to have to choose one option. We got pronouns in 2018. And these are the numbers we have as of last week. So similar to what you see at other institutions, she and her being majority, significant number of they, them, very few doing Z and here. And I have to say, 20 some years ago, I started out using Z and here as my pronouns. And after a few years, switched to they, them because it was so much easier. Getting people to learn a new language is difficult. How do you spell that? I got often asked. People had a hard time remembering that. They, them is much easier because it's already in people's vocabularies. We already use it in the singular. When we don't know someone's gender, we'll say who are they or them rather than he or she. So it was an easy thing for people to pick up. So I'm not surprised that there are very few Z and here folks. Only about 18% of our first year students right now indicate their pronouns. That's a big switch for us because we had made a big push to ask during orientation for students to go into their record online and to put their pronouns in. But of course, with this year, with orientation taking place virtually, that didn't happen. So we lost out on the chance to get a lot of students who are first year students indicate their pronouns because we didn't have that same in-person opportunity to be able to have them go in and update their records to reflect their pronouns. We're different than a lot of institutions in that our pronouns appear much more widely. Most campuses that offer pronouns just have it on class rosters. We've made it as widespread as we can so advisors see it. It's in what we call SPIRE, which is our student record system, so that pretty much most administrative offices have access to students' pronouns. And we've also put it into the UMass online directory for students as well as for staff and faculty. That was the staff and faculty part was a change that we did much more recently as we recognized that we had the capacity, we had the capability to do that. So it's like, hey, let's do that because that's really the only place that for staff and faculty that their pronouns can appear, whereas for students, there obviously is a much larger record that goes to different offices. There wasn't the same ability for staff and faculty, so that was one place we could put pronouns for staff and faculty. So that's makes it much more public, though. So folks need to be recognizing that if you do put your pronouns there, it's going to be something that anyone can see. This is what students will see if they go into their record to add their pronouns. And I don't know how we can read this here, but we wanted to put a few things here. We wanted to indicate why we do this, why it's important that we are asking pronouns of folks. We mentioned who's going to see it, so students are aware of, if they put their pronouns, where it's going to appear. We put a little thing there to indicate to students that if you put your pronouns in there, don't expect magically everyone to know that, especially faculty members. If you're trying to do this so that faculty are aware of your pronouns, you need to recognize that faculty may not be going back to check course rosters. So if you do this after the start of the semester, it's unlikely a faculty member is going to see that you've suddenly added pronouns to your record. And also putting a caveat there too, that parents may see this information if you put that there. So students who are not out may not want to then disclose their pronouns on their administrative records. And then this is what folks would see in the system itself. So pronouns appear right after the individual's name. So this is what students would see. This is what administrators would see as well, who go into a student's record. The pronouns would be right next to the student's name, so they'd be very visible for everyone to see. So that's great that we have this option for pronouns to be visible for folks who want to have them be visible, but it's a challenge to get faculty to recognize that this is there and to make sure that they're seeing that and respecting students' pronouns, and also how to work it so that you can get everyone's pronouns, because most people still don't have their pronouns on their records. So what do you do if you have some folks with pronouns but not other people's pronouns in your class? So try to do as much education as I could. At one point I went around and did presentations to every academic department on campus, which was a lot of work. I have to tell you, we have like 75 different departments, so a lot of presentations to have to do over the course of a couple of years to educate. But that wasn't really enough that happened before we actually had pronouns even. It was sort of like, we're gonna have pronouns, just so you know, get prepared. It would be great to be able to do more of that, but unfortunately, I haven't been able to get the support from the university to do a larger pronoun education campaign, even though our own research demonstrates that trans students have the worst experiences on campus of any group of individuals. And misgendering is a large part of why they have such a negative experience. Our trans students, more than any other group, rate the campus climate as being negative and have the least sense of belonging, which is very common at institutions. So it's not wasn't a surprise to me when we found that in our research. But it's unfortunate that our university doesn't take that more seriously and try to do more to address that. It's also difficult to inform students about the option to indicate their pronouns. And here's the difficulty of having sort of an opt-in versus an opt-out system. You know, as I mentioned, this really needs to be on the college admission form, so everyone's going to see it. Everyone then would have the option to indicate their pronouns, and most folks would if you had it on an admission form, just as we have on our form. We ask sexual orientation and gender identity, and the vast majority of students indicate their sexual orientation and gender identity. So I have to believe if we had a pronoun question on our application form, that students would disclose what pronouns they use for themselves, and we have much higher numbers. It's difficult to get students to take the time to go into their record and indicate their pronouns. And many cis students don't see the need to do so. So it's having to educate them about why pronouns are important for everyone. And it's not just a trans thing. And then, of course, as I said before, not all trans students want to indicate their pronouns, especially since they will be visible to anyone who searches for them on the UMass directory. It's been easier for me to educate administrative staff people, my colleagues, about pronouns. I've been able to do presentations for a lot of departments around campus about pronouns. And it's really important to be educating the folks who have access to students' pronouns, because it occurred to me that all of a sudden, a lot of our staff people have privileged information. They have information that is HIPAA protected that they didn't have before. So having to educate staff people about the fact that they need to be aware that pronouns are there, to respect students' pronouns, but at the same time, not be disclosing those pronouns accidentally when they interact with family members. So what I tell staff people is, if you're talking with a parent or guardian, to sort of take your clue from that person, that parent or guardian, how they're gendering their child. Because you don't want to get into a situation where you indicate a student's gender and the parent or guardian isn't aware that that's how the student is identifying themselves. So this typically comes up if someone is using a pronoun that's not what a parent would expect, using they or them or z here, or using sort of quote unquote the opposite for a trans man or trans woman. That could potentially out the student to their families. So what I tell staff people is to listen to what the parent does. If they're misgendering the child, you don't have to. You could just talk about them as the student, or use they, them, because that's a good way to refer to someone without necessarily attaching a gender, to use that third person. But really make sure that you're not going to say something that's going to impinge that student's safety or comfort. And of course, I tell staff that a lot of times, if you're talking with a student, you're not going to need to reference their pronouns. But if you are in a situation where you need to use third person pronouns, you can use they, them if you need to, but you can also just ask someone in the moment what pronouns they use for themselves. I see students doing this all the time. It's second nature to a lot of students to be having conversations and just as part of like, oh, what's your name, what's your pronouns, what's your major, those sort of asking those sort of questions just in the flow of things, and not being sort of awkward. But it's awkward for a lot of folks in older generations who are not used to that, who didn't grow up with that. But that doesn't provide really an excuse. You really need to, if you're going to be working with students, you need to be understanding that a lot of students identify as non-binary and want to be asked their pronouns. So it's a matter of having to sort of catch up for faculty and staff a lot of times. If folks get pronouns wrong, the best thing to do is simply say you're sorry and correct yourself and say I'll do better in the future, and then do better in the future. Or if someone else corrects you, say thank you, because that's taking a certain risk there to be correcting someone, because you don't know how that person might respond. So if someone does take that risk to correct you, saying thank you is really a useful response. I don't know how well you can see this cartoon, but one of the things that I find frustrating is when someone misgenders me and I call them on it. I don't want people to overly apologize. Simply saying you're sorry is good. Over apologizing is this weird thing because it puts me in an awkward situation. You know, someone who goes on and on like, oh, I'm so sorry. You know, I didn't grow up with this. I'm not used to this. I'm still trying to learn this. I don't care. You know, you screwed up. You know, you misgendered me. You know, you made me feel uncomfortable. I I shouldn't be in a position where I'm having to feel bad for you. You know, you should get over yourself and get into the 21st century. If someone else misgenders someone and you hear it, you could, if it's appropriate, if it feels okay, you can correct that person in the conversation. If that doesn't feel comfortable, you can talk to that person afterward and say, hey, this person uses these pronouns in case you didn't know that. You can also talk to the person who's been misgendered, you know, to recognize, hey, I recognize that happened. That really sucks. I know that can be really hurtful. Is there anything I can do to support you? Do you want me to try to talk to this person on your behalf? I gotta say, if someone uses they, them pronouns, it really is great when someone else is there for me, who has my back. So it's not always me who has to call out someone who misgenders me and always be the person who does that. I appreciate when other people say on my behalf that, you know, Genny uses they, them pronouns, you know, so I recognize that I have support. Some things to keep in mind is, and I see this all the time about using the word preferred. You know, we've gotten away from saying sexual preference, thank God, but we're still often using preferred name or preferred pronouns. And it's not a preference. It's the pronouns I use. It's the pronouns I go by. There isn't sort of a ranked order here that I would prefer you use this, but you have some other option. No, there's no other option. This is what you got to use for me. Recognize too that not everyone wants to share their pronouns. So if you're asking folks in a group to share pronouns, do it in a way that provides a space for people not to have to share their pronouns. So this, you know, when I teach, this is the sort of language that I use, recognizing that some folks want to indicate their pronouns, and for them it's really important that people know their pronouns, so they don't want to be misgendered. Other people may not feel safe in a particular environment to want to disclose their pronouns, or may still be thinking about what pronouns they want to use for themselves, so don't want to say anything. One of the stories that really impacted me about this was a few years ago. Was talking with a incoming student who used they, them pronouns for themselves, and said that on their first day, the class that they took, the teacher asked, we went around and the teacher asked people to indicate their pronouns, as well as, you know, name and probably some other stuff as well. And the student didn't feel on that first day on campus comfortable coming out essentially to all of these strangers and indicating their pronouns. So ended up saying, I think, she, her, which is what someone might expect by looking at them. But the student said to me just how much they appreciated having the opportunity to decide for themselves what pronouns they wanted to use, to have sort of that agency, that power, rather than the professor potentially misgendering them. So even though they didn't take advantage of it and indicate the correct pronouns, the appropriate pronouns they used for themselves, they still appreciated the opportunity to be able to decide what they wanted to do in that moment. And I never saw the student again, so I don't know how that story turned out. I have to believe, though, that given the fact that the professor is trying to create this inclusive environment in the classroom, that maybe later on in the semester, that student would feel more comfortable indicating that they use they, them pronouns for themselves because they felt included and welcomed in that environment and got to know people and felt somewhat safer then. And then we include on our website sort of an official pronoun FAQ of the university, which has some good information there about pronouns and again, why it's important and how to pronounce Z and here and some other resources for folks, some different web links. So you can check that out if you want to by going to umass.edu/Stonewall. It's right on our front page. And we're trying to create a pronoun inclusive culture on campus. And I think we're making some good progress with this as we're working with students who are growing up with this as part of what they're being socialized into, to recognize the importance of pronouns. But trying to get faculty and staff onto this is where the challenge lies, I think. But getting folks to introduce themselves by using their pronouns, getting pronouns in email signatures and on name tags, got the university to, we have an official name tag. And although pronouns are not part of that official name tag, you can ask to have that now included on it. A lot of our student affairs staff have their pronouns in their email signatures, which I think is great. Even though I would say that probably everyone, I'm trying to think of any exceptions, but pretty much everyone who has their pronouns in their email signature are using the pronouns that you would expect them to use. So it's not really going out on a huge limb for folks. But at the same time, I think it's pretty revolutionary, because what it's saying is, okay, I may look a certain way, but I don't want you to assume from that I use a particular set of pronouns, because someone can look just like me, be presenting in a feminine way or a masculine way, and not be using she, her, or he, him, respectively for that. So I don't want you to make that assumption about me, because you can't make that assumption about people in general. And I think that's really, really important to be putting out there, even though it's not, no one's coming out here and doing something that is unexpected. I still think it's really valuable that people are doing that, because there are folks who don't use you would expect them to use, because of course, how do you, if you're non-binary, how do you present as non-binary, right? I guess you could androgynously or something, but why should you have to? You know, it's like, just, you could be non-binary and be presenting in a very feminine way or a very masculine way, and that should be okay. You shouldn't have to be androgynous in order to claim they and them or ze or here or other non-binary pronouns for yourself. You should be able just to be yourself and to identify as how you want to identify. The gender presentation shouldn't have anything to do with that. And then we also have pronoun buttons and little guides to how to use pronouns that we've circulated around campus and make available in offices where students go a lot. So, and of course that's changed now this year, but hopefully next year we'll go back to having that happen. So like our Dean of Students office, our counseling center, our health center, our library, they really supported us on this. I did a training for all of the different departments in our library, a lot of the student workers in the library, and they have pronoun buttons at all of their sort of information desks in the library. And that's important, because one of the things I'm trying to do is also getting people to avoid using gender language like sir and ma'am. And that's a big part of how people are socialized to, in customer service jobs, to be doing that. And it's perfectly polite just to say thank you very much. You don't need to add a sir or ma'am onto that. So really trying to work with our customer service folks to get them to stop gendering people unnecessarily. You don't need to be doing that. And it's not appropriate when so many people don't identify as a sir or a ma'am or a Mr. or a Ms. and just simply referring to people without having to indicate a gender. So but that's a difficult one, to get people to sort of unlearn what they've been taught to do and what they've grown up with, especially again older folks. So what I'm planning to do in the future is to really try to continue to get pronouns listed. We get more students to indicate their pronouns. So on all of our events, we try to put out there, hey, if you haven't already done so, indicate your pronouns. We will often bring a laptop with us so students can take a minute and go into their record and indicate their pronouns. When students come back, hopefully next fall in droves, we'll be able to really step this up more. We want to continue to get our pronoun buttons out there on campus because they're widely taken. We've gotten a lot of people to, I see them on folks' backpack. We also have different sexual and gender identity buttons as well that we pass out, and we see a lot of them as well. So it's great to see those on people's backpacks. So we want to continue to put those out there. And to do more with International Pronouns Day, which again, once we're back in person, we can do a bit more than we are doing today, which is basically just doing social media stuff. We typically have a table in our student union. We would typically do some sort of educational event, sort of what I'm doing today for you all. I will do on campus for faculty and staff people, which because we're virtual this year, I'm not doing, but that's some of the things we have in mind to do in the future. So happy to take folks' questions that they have. Have about 15, 20 minutes. I see lots, so happy to get any questions that people might have.
Hi, I have a question. What is your opinion on people who necessarily don't want to use neo pronouns because they think it sounds weird or they just don't want to use them?
Give me more of a context. Are we talking about cis people?
Yeah, so cis or even fellow trans people that maybe are oh, neo pronouns are gross because they're weird, and they make a joke of the trans community and things like that. How do you recommend educating those kind of people?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I've run into a few people like that. I was in a meeting, and it was actually, believe it or not, the university's diversity committee, and I got the chair, educated the chair to be asking pronouns, because every time we went around, I would share my pronouns, and finally the chair dawned on me, maybe we should have everyone indicate their pronouns. But there was one senior administration person, very high ranking, when it got to him, who said, I don't find this useful to indicate pronouns. I don't, this is personal information. I shouldn't be able to divulge this. Why are we asking this? And if, I jumped in, a couple other people jumped in to try to educate them about the fact, well, that's fine and dandy for you that you don't, want to indicate your pronouns. And of course, this person was a very cis individual. But for other people, this really matters because they get misgendered. You're not going to be misgendered. No one's going to mistake you as other than an old white guy. So I think that it's just trying to get people to recognize that the privilege that they have, whether they're a trans man or a cis individual who looks very gendered in a certain way, and who uses the pronouns you would expect them to use based upon their presentation. Not everyone is in that boat. Not everyone is in that situation and has that privilege that they have. So it's trying to educate people about sort of a privilege that they have, just as you're trying to educate other people about privileges in general that they may have. And it can be a hard sell, in terms of racial privilege or ableism, or, how people with our privilege don't recognize the privilege that they have and are very quick to be dismissive because it doesn't affect them. They don't see it.
Thank you very much.
Ken, I think we had another question from you.
Hi, Dr. Beemyn. It's Ken Ditlevson. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the director of our LGBTQ+ Center. I'm so glad that you were able to link with us today. This has been really, really helpful. And hopefully we can have you to campus some point. So we'd love to see you at Kent State when it's safe to do so. I've got two questions for you. We're in the process of really trying to push for pronouns, and you gave a lot of really helpful tips. We're working with our admissions team. But I just want to tell you, we've had some issues with our preferred name process, specifically with mailings going home. And so I just wondered if you could speak to that. Our policy has been that we use legal name, but then some college units have been like wanting to do, inclusiveness and trying to be kind to their students. They ended up sending stuff home using preferred name, and that caused some issues for certain students. So I just wondered if you could speak to that. And then my second question was around changing gender markers, and if you can share just a little bit about how you were able to work on that, because we've not made any headway on that piece. Thank you.
Sure. And nice to meet you virtually. For the name, we actually have two systems, which was designed to avoid the situation you describe about students inadvertently being outed to families. Although we still have that come up at times and still happen at times, unfortunately. But any student can go into their online record and indicate a chosen or preferred name. And in this case, there actually is a preferred. You can say, I go by Thomas opposed to Thomas. And that will appear on course rosters only. And we get a whole bunch of students doing that, not just trans students, obviously. Trans students can do that, but also they can do a separate process where they fill out a form that goes to the registrar's office where they can indicate a name that they want to be the name that they go by on all of their non-legal records. And so that would be on their university ID card. It would show up on pretty much anything that anyone would see. And that creates a process then where that name will be shared with family, because anything that gets sent home, although that's becoming more and more a passe thing to actually send things home, but any communication done with the student that will be using that name. So that requires students to be out to their families or taking a risk that their families would end up seeing that name on things. Like, for example, if you are living in the residence hall, when you get sent your information about where to go, when to get into the residence hall, it's going to have that name, or the name that appears on your residence hall door is going to be that name. So we created that process so that students could, if they're not out to their families, could at least have their course rosters reflect the name that they want to have. But if if they're out to their families, then they can use that other process that changes things more universally. And that's been, I think, a help. Although again, there has been some bleed through where people have found that the wrong name is being sent to is put on things, because of course we can't control all the software that's out there that departments are using. When we did the name change, we found out that we had to change, I think it was 21 different systems on campus to make sure that that chosen name was being recognized. So we had to change the software to basically say, if there is a name in the chosen name field, use that. If not, use the legal name. So what was happening was the student would go to one of our dining commons and their card would be swiped and the name would come up. That's not the name that's on the ID card. Or if they go to their residence hall and swipe in, same thing happening. So boom, student gets outed. We had a lot of that happening. Happens a lot less now that we figured out some of the holes where we were missing updating the software, but that took really having to change all of the major systems on campus to recognize the chosen name field. And I got to believe, though, that there are departments that don't use the same software, that have their own little system in place that they are using. And so they're not looking at the chosen name fields, so they're using student's legal name when they shouldn't be, or they're not recognizing students' pronouns. In fact, our provost office just sent sort of coinciding with International Pronouns Day, sent out a message to all faculty, all departments on campus to basically say, hey, make sure that you're recognizing that there is this chosen name field, that there are pronouns on students' records, that you're making sure that your software is recognizing those fields, and make sure that as you as a faculty member are respecting that information. So it's a learning process, but it's also a software process. In terms of the gender change, it was a little bit of a hard sell to get them to agree to change, to allow that change to happen. Now it's only between M and F, so it's a gender binary. Still fighting the battle to add non-binary to that. In fact, still just this week was trying to get that to happen. Got the registrar's office on board, but now the folks who are having to process the data are sort of concerned about this. The issue that comes up is that the federal government only wants M and F. So what do you do if you have students who are identifying as other than M and F? And my response is like, well, you still have students, quote unquote, legal sex. Our application, we use the Common App. There's a question that asks, are you an M or F? It doesn't give you an option to identify as other than that. Now, we've added a question ourselves later on in the application that gives people a chance to actually say what their gender identity is. But as far as the Common App, there's just the M and F there with the ability to indicate below that if there's anything else you want to share about your gender. I spent years and years trying to get the Common App to change how they ask that question and to have more options, and that's what they ultimately came to. I was more successful with some other university application forms that they're not quite as big as the Common App. I was able to get like the university, what's called? Universal, I forget what it's called. It's some other platform that has only about 100 schools participating. I was able to get them to add a question on gender identity that's more inclusive. Common App kept turning me down on trying to do that, and the best they would do was add that box to say, indicate anything else you want to tell us about your gender. But so anyway, our university has the information to be able to report M and F. So there shouldn't be any reason they can't give students the ability to indicate on their record that they identify as non-binary. It really is not going to make a difference anyplace, really, because gender doesn't appear in any sort of public way. So it's not really going to matter that someone is officially known as non-binary by the university. But I think it's just important, just for people to feel like they're being recognized as who they are by the institution, even though it's not going to have any bearing. As I mentioned, we ask gender identity of our students. At this point, no one uses that information. I go through it and compile data so I know how many students are identifying as LGBT. Could also ask sexual orientation as well on our application. How many students identify as LGBTQ+, and how people identify specifically and such. And but no one else uses that information at this point. Although we're going to start using that for res life housing assignments. Hopefully next year. I don't know if the pandemic's going to slow that down any, but we're planning to go to a process where housing's based upon gender identity rather than that stupid legal sex thing, which makes no sense.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to ask a question?
Yeah, My name's Erica Pels. I'm the advisor to our trans student group. So this is, something that affects me both personally and in a more professional way. I've been dealing with pronouns for 25 years personally, and I've started to see this very strange thing popping up. I'm seeing people saying that their pronouns are it and its. Now originally when I first started seeing this, it was like people who weren't native English speakers, and so this was kind of a weird thing. But I'm trying to explain to people why this is really not something you want to do, because it leads to othering and all sorts of bad things. And I'm just wondering, are you seeing any of this? This seems to be becoming more common in younger people, and I'm very troubled by this trend.
Yes, thanks, Erica, for asking that, and nice to hear from you. Yes, I've seen a few students use that, and I cringe, I have to say, because of that being used as such a way to disparage and express hatred towards trans people, referring to us as it. And it's not language that I see we can take back. It just, of course, with any language, no matter how horrific, there are some folks who will try to take that back. We see that with the N-word, or with the B word to describe women, some gay men using the F word for themselves. I think there might be, for younger people who use it, for some of them, it might be just a lack of knowing the history, knowing how that has been used against us. I had a conversation, I had a student who emailed me to ask why we weren't offering it as a pronoun choice. And I wrote back to explain, because that's been a derogatory way that trans people have been referred to dismiss us. And the student wrote back to say, oh, I get that. I'm not going to use that anymore. So I think there might also be an educational piece to that, of students not recognizing, or younger people not recognizing how that's been really offensive, and how that really still stings to be having people think of us as being less than human, right? We're not being gender. We're seen as sort of like an animal. So yeah, it's really troubling to me that there are some folks who are doing that. I think it is beyond the pale to be being used. And I hope that's not a growing trend we will see.
I hope you're correct. Thank you for your perspective on that. I definitely agree. It's something that's been used in far too horrific a way to try to reclaim it. I'm all for reclaiming words, but I don't think that one's redeemable.
We've got just a few minutes. Does anybody have one final question that they are dying to ask?
And I give my email there, so feel free, if you have questions that come up for you later, or if I can bring you any assistance, just please let me know.
All right, well, if there's no other questions, I want to extend a thank you to QGrad and Graduate Student Senate for funding this event, and especially a huge thank you to Genny for actually coming today and speaking about this very important topic and something that we're looking to do at Kent State. Genny, again, thank you so much for lending us your time today. It was very informative. We really appreciate what you're doing and continuing to do for the community. And with that, I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and a great weekend.
Bye-bye. It's nice presenting for you.